Good evening and good day, everyone, depending on where you are, and welcome to this evening public lecture at the GSD. I'm delighted today's talk is going to be by Vittorio Lampugnani, who is currently visiting and teaching at the GSD. But before I go to introduce him and we start with the evening, a quick reminder about some features you'll see in the Zoom webinar. The chat function has been disabled so that we all may focus on Vittorio's presentation. Vittorio will respond to questions after he has finished his lecture. So feel free to submit questions into the queue at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have closed captioning available for this event. To enable captions, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. Before we get things started tonight, I want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. On Tuesday, September 21st at 6:30 p.m., Anne Anling Cheng will give a lecture exploring how racialized gender, specifically the specter of the yellow woman, animates the design of futurity. And on Thursday, September 23rd and Friday, September 24th, the GSD Alumni Council hosts Design Impact Following the Sun, Design Futures at the Intersection of Health, Equity, and Climate Change, a global virtual summit. All events will happen on Zoom and require virtual attendees to register. More information about these events, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. And with that, now let's move to tonight's event. The title of the talk today is The City as Accumulated Knowledge, Urban Design Research. Vittorio Lampugnani, who's going to present his thoughts to us and share them, he believes that architecture, or like architecture and landscape architecture, but possibly even more so, urban design is a discipline that relies on a precise and complex knowledge. This knowledge has been patiently accumulated over time and is the sum of the intelligence, experience, and creativity of those who have built up our cities and the discipline itself. He, of course, clarifies that this is a set of observations and thoughts that he's extended out of his experiences in Europe, and that's what he will share with us. But he believes that this methodology proposed can be applied to many cultural contexts, and I hope this will be a subject of discussion about its transferability around completely different, sometimes ideological, political conditions and what that might mean. And I think, Vittorio, I hope we can explore that a little bit in the questions and answers. Vittorio is a really interesting, first of all, Vittorio is someone who chooses his words very carefully, and you'll see that in today's lecture. But I think what's remarkable about him is also the way he has combined his theoretical position, his interest in the historical dimensions of urban design, but also as a practitioner made his talk really walk. Besides obtaining his PhD, so he is sort of a doctorate, he played a seminal role in the International Building Exhibition in Berlin. These were very fertile forums, in a sense, for the exploration of urban design and the kinds of formulations that we engage with today. And he also served as the member of the editorial board of Casabella, which is a magazine based in Milan, and served as the chief editor of Domus magazine, and as the director of the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt am Main. And so he kind of has been engaged with these platforms and forums to disseminate these ideas, popularize, but also critically have people engage with them. From 1994 to 2016, he held the chair for History of Urban Design at the ETH in Zurich, the ETH, and has been since 1981 practicing both in Milan as well as with a partner in Zurich. He kind of advocates for architectural and urban sustainability, and his own projects are wide-ranging. He'll share some of them with us. He's done the famous Novartis campuses, written guidelines for those campuses in other parts of the world, and office buildings in Zurich, other parts of Europe. And his most recent book is called A Radical Normal, and I believe he'll present that book in our library book discussion sessions later in the semester. Vittorio argues against the autonomy of architecture and for seeing a kind of a production and an imagination of architecture informed by the context, both in terms of it being informed, but also how it generates the context. And so for him, urban design is this process of translating the common interest in architecture and city form. And I believe these are some of the many thoughts he'll share with us, and I look forward to a discussion at the end of this, Vittorio. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Vittorio, to deliver this talk as part of our GST public lecture series. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rahul, for this very kind and friendly and flattering introduction. What Rahul has not said introducing my lecture, my dear colleagues and friends who are watching and listening and whom I unfortunately cannot see, what he has not said is that you will have to put up with my Italian cultural and linguistic limitations. Well, the cultural limitations here already hinted at. I will show basically, well, mostly Italian and no, let's say European case studies, and I think, but that will be a subject of discussion. I think they can be translated into different cultural contexts. With respect to my Italian English, here I have to appeal to your tolerance and patience. I would like to lead you through a few questions that I'm really personally interested in. The question of how we can look at our built environment, the question of how we can take the knowledge that we know, but that we have about our urban environment and link it to genealogies, how we can systematize this knowledge in books and manuals and yes, instructions almost, you might say, and then of course how we can use the learnings from the cities for our work as architects, urban designers, planners, whatever. So let me, if I succeed with these technological issues, so I hope it works. And first of all, I would like to lead you to an urban square in one of the cities of my country. It's in Florence, and you will be probably disappointed from the very beginning because it is not, one of the famous squares that you know, Piazza del Duomo or Piazza della Signoria. It's in between, and it is Piazza della Repubblica. Let us just have a look. It's a very normal 19th century square, pretty spacious, with streets coming in, with rather, I think, well-articulated facades, and with a very surprising floor under the arcade that is following basically only one side of the square. You will see and understand a little bit more of the square by knowing a few things about its history. In fact, in the very place where the square was built, there originally was the market square, or if you want to go even a little bit more backwards, so to the Roman Florencia, it was the forum and the crossing of the two main streets of Florence. But even in medieval time, of course, Piazza della Signoria became much more important, but Piazza del Mercato, as it calls, so the marketplace, remained, as you can see it here. In the 19th century, it was decided, late 19th century, very late in the 80s. So curiously, after Florence had been capital of Italy and also already given up this role to Rome, it was decided to renovate this whole situation. You can see a survey of the situation before this changes. And here is the project of this new square. It's very typical 19th century, of course, for the king. And all around the square, new buildings. So basically it's a speculation project, had to be constructed. And an arcade, you can see it here in the top, be built, which in fact happened. That's how the square looks like in plan now. So this is again a survey, and then this was a very complicated competition. I will not bore you with that. About 40 projects were made for this square. Then they were not in agreement with the facade, so there was another competition. This is the entry that won, and this is the realization. So you will say, okay, it's a square, but where does it come from? What does it mean for us in terms of the city? And in fact, it's not an invention, clearly, not at all. It's a 19th century square that is based on a long tradition of squares, like, for instance, Covent Garden, that was constructed, planned and constructed by Inigo Jones in 1630, so much earlier, clearly. Again, a rectangular square, again, an arcade, only in two parts of the square. What you see here is three developments of what the square was there for, because it was the focus of basically of a speculation project for Francis Russell, the first Earl of Bedford, who developed this land and asked Inigo Jones to create a square. It was originally a private square, to give more value to the buildings surrounding it. This is the image of Covent Garden as it was originally. In Covent Garden too was not an imitation, but was strongly inspired, let's say, by squares like this. This is Charleville, Place Ducale, of 1600 and between 1612 and 1628. And again, this Place Ducale was influenced, or was, in this case, it was really an imitation, I would say, of a type that was a Place Royale. Now it's called Place des Vosges. You can see here in an image how it is cut in the very middle of Paris. It was an idea of Henri IV, who 1605 decided to create a place in the middle of Paris with something that we would call now luxury housing. So with this is a situation, this you can see where it was. So it was not so in such a dense structure originally, and this is what it. Let's say he built it a series. In fact, it's a series of pavilions of single houses that create an exact rectangle with an arcade, very homogeneous. And the idea behind this was to have the French aristocracy who was living all around Paris, to have them in the city, to have them together and to create a kind of, yes, communication and possibly understanding. The square was initially empty. It was used for games, like you can see here, or big feasts. This is a feast for a wedding, an important wedding. And this is a situation as you can see it now, and as you all probably know it. This Place des Vosges, Place Royale, became really a kind of archetype of the so-called king's royal squares. So it was followed immediately by Place Dauphine, Place des Victoires, and Place Vendôme. Here you can see them in the Plan Turgot. And again, these squares here were inspired by the Piazza d'Armi. Today it's Piazza Grande in Livorno, which was built earlier, late 16th century, with very beautiful arcades that unfortunately have been modified and partially destroyed. It was influenced by the Plaza Mayor. As you can see it now, it's later. It was built later than Place des Vosges, but as a, let's say, the idea of a square cut into the urban fabric was earlier. And you can see it even still going back. And we are again in Florence, in Piazza della Santissima Annunziata, what I consider really a totally incredible square. I will not tell you the whole story, but the square is originally a very, very modest square. It starts with the loggia by Brunelleschi, who builds it 1409. He starts building it 1419. Then different parts are made, and about 100 years later, Antonio da San Gallo has to make the other side of the square. And here something, to me, absolutely incredible happens, because San Gallo, who was, an important architect, decided to complete the work of Brunelleschi and basically imitated almost literally the arcade of the Ospedale degli Innocenzi by Brunelleschi. Anyway, again, a very regular square that in fact goes back, and Henri IV knew it very well, knew this square very well, to a square in Vigevano, which you can see here in this side here. And if you see the square and if you see the castle, in its dimension, you see already, let's say, the intention of the square. It was initiated and realized and paid for by Ludovico Sforza, Ludovico il Moro. In 1492, work was started. After 2 years, it was finished, and very, very quick. And it was really meant to be a kind of entrance of the castle. You see in this original drawing, this feature here, which is a stair, a big stair leading, let's say, the castle is much higher, leading from the square up to the castle. Eventually, this was then torn down, the stair, in order to create a really totally homogeneous square. All the houses were new. The arcade is so continuous, and in fact also this layer of housing, because it's a very thin layer, it's so continuous that you can't even see the streets, but there are streets. And it goes so far as to influence the building of the, much later of course, of the Baroque facade of the church that closes the fourth side of the square. And you can see this is the street, Via Roma, that enters this, the square, but is camouflaged as one of the doors of the church in order to make it really totally symmetrical and homogeneous. And we could go back again to things that Henri IV knew. This is one of the Bastides of France, Bastide Montpensier, of the early 13th, no, middle of the 13th century, where again you have very simple geometrical square with arcades, and in some ways all this goes back to the imperial Roman forum. This is the Forum of Augustus in a reconstruction of the 19th century, where you can, I think, imagine this enormous free space that was created as a free space for the people in Rome, because the old Forum Romanum was totally crowded, but also as let's say, triumphal representation of Augustus himself. And we could go back, of course, then to the agorae, to the Hellenistic agorae, and back to the agora of Athens, which is in some way the point where all this starts. To make it very clear, this is not the genealogy of the Piazza della Repubblica. It is my genealogy. It is what I interpret, what I see. Partially, it's consolidated historical knowledge, because we know, for instance, what certain people have looked at, but the rest is I wouldn't say invention, but in any case, interpretation. This knowledge about the city, this understanding of a city, has always played an important role in city building. City building has always been something that has been very conscious, very deliberate, where theories have been developed, or at least thinking about the city, and where this thinking and also the results have been systematized. And they have been systematized in books, in manuals, beginning with Alberti's De Reedificatoria of 1541, where he speaks a lot about city planning, urban design, I would say, but then becomes really crucial in the 19th century, where the big city extension makes this, let's say, this knowledge, this organization of knowledge absolutely crucial. So, for instance, Adolphe Alphand, the engineer who works under Georges-Eugène Haussmann for the Paris of Napoleon III, he starts documenting every single, let's say, urban intervention that he does in Paris. It is both. This book is both. It is a documentation of what he has done. He's also a little bit vain, but it is also a way to make this knowledge and what he has done, this experiment, to make them usable for other cities, which in fact happened. There is a whole series after, this was 1800 and between 67 and 73. Then in the later 19th century, there's a whole lot of similar books. Richard Baumeister, very technical approach in 22 chapters, all what is known at that time about an engineering city construction. Camillo Sitte, who takes exactly the opposite approach, showing how a city should be composed really in architectural terms in order to be pleasant for the pedestrian mainly. And then Joseph Stüben, who with his Handbuch der Architektur and his no, sorry, it's not that. It is part of the Handbuch der Architektur, which is even larger. It's many volumes. But one of these volumes, it's called Städtebau, and that's what Josef Stüben produced. I mean, it's still pretty thick. It's more than 1,000 pages, and he collects every aspect of the city. What I like most are these street sections of all important streets in the world, and then. In the early 20s, well, the belief in really making a manual is not that strong anymore. So Werner Hegemann and Albert Pietz, when they produce their civic art or their American Vitruvius, they don't call it a manual, they call it a thesaurus. In fact, it is a kind of collection of interesting urban situation all over the world and over time. A very interesting book. We thought, this was my chair at ETH, we thought we could also do something like that. We want to collect knowledge about the city, and of course we don't believe in manuals as something that you can use one-to-one, but we believe in examples. We believe in studying those examples better. So we collected around 70 what we considered important squares, streets, embankments, parks, all over Europe, and organized them in such a way. And here you will recognize again Piazza della Repubblica. We organized them in first showing in the scale 1 to 10,000 to show the let's say the situation of the urban space and its localization. So in this case, we are here in Piazza della Repubblica. So it's really about its position and its situation in the city. Then we go to the scale 1 to 2,000, and this is now about the proportions of in this case, the square, the dimensions, the relations of volumes to voids. Then we go a little bit deeper, 1 to 500, and that's about how the architecture around the space engages in this space. I don't believe in separating architecture from urban spaces. Urban spaces are created by architecture, and the way this architecture lands how in this space is absolutely crucial. So crucial that in the case of Piazza della Repubblica, we wanted to see the ground floor, which you have seen right now, and let's say a normal floor, an upper floor, and it goes then till the scale 1 to 100, where we start showing the details, how really the houses sit on the ground, and then I admit my personal obsessions: the paving, the floor, the bollards, the lamps, all these things that you may smile, but I consider absolutely important for the character of this urban situations. And then, of course, some images that you have already seen. I think that the collection of all this, I mean, showing, analyzing all these urban spaces in the same way, and drawing them up in the same scale is very instructive. Not just, for instance, here in the big scale, just to see the different textures of the city, like I don't know, Paris and Berlin, for instance, or Amsterdam, shows this incredible difference. The same applies to the next scale, where you can see really the different dimension of the square. It's interesting to see how small, for instance, Piazza della Repubblica is compared with the Place de Vosges, and then going even more down to the real details. You can see how the architecture engages in this with these places, and again also the details and the scale of those details, which is, I think, a very interesting and important question. So why are we doing all this? We're doing all this because it's a way of really understanding better a city, but it's also, and especially because it's a way of understanding better the strategies that have been developed in history to, let's say, house humans. To these squares are successful strategies for very specific social functions, and that's why I think they have a lot to tell us, and that's why I think we must use them, again, not as models. We are not to copy them, but as lessons, or you may say as types, to use the differentiation that Quatremer de Cancy did between model and type. He says model is something that you copy exactly as it is. Type is something that is more strategical and can be realized, designed and realized in millions of different ways. And this is, let's say, my approach, if you want. Let me now look at the watch, and if I may show you or lead you again rapidly through 3 new squares that we did in 3 different projects. One is a project that Rahul has already mentioned and that he knows very well because he has built a very beautiful building in it. It's the campus of Novartis. Very briefly, this was the situation before we came in, a rather chaotic ex-industrial compound. This is the situation now. It's still unfinished. I'm not unhappy that it's unfinished, because I think that every city needs a lot of time. But this shows, let's say, how much has been built. The first sketch shows our idea of creating, basically, well, the brief was to create a place for research and administration of the company. It's the headquarters of a pharmaceutical company, but to create a place where people would really interact and would. The briefing was doing an architecture or an urban design where people will work differently, and so we tried to. We asked ourselves, what is the best device for communication that architecture has ever invented? And this device is the city. The city is the place where we want to, to meet and encounter other people. So we sketched this. This is the very first sketch. It has this idea of very small buildings, so that people would have to get out of the building and meet in a series of public spaces along this main axis that you can maybe see here. And along this axis, a series of public spaces were attached. And I will talk only about this. This is the forum, which is somehow the main square. The master plan changed 100,000 times, like every master plan probably. This is the master plan that is valid today, but it may be changed soon again. What did not change until now, at least, is the structure of the public spaces. And this is the forum that we designed together with, it was a very collective effort. The landscape architect was Peter Walker, then there was Harald Seemann as the art curator, Alan Fletcher as graphic designer, and myself. Very simple. Square meant as a place where the associates would gather, work, talk, drink, very open in terms of functions. Very simple, as you can see, it's gravel. There is a basin in the middle, and very nice big trees, and that's about all. And it's a very simple, but we think functioning square. Another case is something we did afterwards. This was rather large. I mean, this was for 10,000 people, a kind of a small research city. This was or is an urban quarter, you may say, in the periphery of Zurich. This is a situation before we started. It's pretty well, let's say typical for suburbia, for Swiss suburbia. So you have the rail, you have an important street, you have the highway, you have a shopping mall, you have another shopping mall, everything that your heart desires. And what we decided to do is to create really a piece of a city, to say, okay, we don't comply with this small scale that let's say of a village that is not a village anymore, but we try to do a piece of a city, hoping that it will then develop into something larger, which it didn't. Tell you right away. You can see the change of scale that we decided, and this is the situation, and you can see here. In the middle, since we wanted, it's a bit small. It's about a little less than 5,000 people, of which most are people only working there, not living there. It's a mixed use, but it's biased towards office space, which is a problem, I think. But we could not change that too much. In any case, we decided again that it needed a moment of peace, of openness, a square. And we could convince the developer, it's a private development, to give up a piece of his precious land, like the English, like the Earl of Bedford with Inigo Jones. We are not Inigo Jones. To give up this a little bit of it, to create something that would increase the value of the whole development. We designed this square in a very simple way because we didn't want to encumber it with stuff. So it has just a few trees, it has a fountain, and the rest is free because we wanted, and thank God it happens, also to accommodate market. And this is how it's realized. Again, very simple, very cheap. Gravel, a few trees, and a fountain. About the fountain, that was so complicated to do this fountain but I won't bore you with the story of the fountain. It cost me two big folders of correspondence to be able to do it. And last but not least, maybe also least, I don't know, a square that we we did not do it again. We modified it. It's this square here. It's in the middle of Zurich. It's a very industrial situation, as you can see. But and this part here had to be remodeled. This building had to be torn down. Those were at disposal, let's say. This is a very interesting industrial building that has been transformed into a restaurant, theater, and bar, and is very popular in Zurich. So this is the situation here, and we decided that we wanted to create a building that would define this place here as not a new but an enlarged square. This meant that we would tear down these two buildings that you see in the forefront. Here you can see the industrial cultural building that I told you about, that happened again. It was a competition, and we tried to do a very articulated building that would create here this enlarged square, here a very small second, very hidden, quiet square, and here a new streetscape, this pedestrian street in the back. And we wanted to create also these courtyards, and you can see that, oops, this was wrong. And these courtyards we connected with, let's say, with the public space. So this is the square here, and these are the courtyards, and you can see they are connected. In fact, what we did is we put this the lobby, the main lobby of the building, it's an office building, right in the middle of, let's say, a large courtyard, dividing it into two. I have also to say that the courtyards are very small. That's why we wanted to open them up as much as we could, because the small courtyards were the price that we paid for being able to do the square, because the square meters, of course, being a developer, this building had to remain the same. This is the situation as it is now. So this is the square, basically, the square that we were able to create. We were able to keep this wonderful tree alive. That was not so easy. Plant a few new trees, and that's how it looks. That the building engages very much towards the square and opens up here. You can see it also from the upside. It opens up where the lobby is and where you can go through and enter. Now we look at the square and enter the courtyards that I mentioned. And these are the courtyards. They are very small, but thanks to the fact that they are connected both with the square and with the street, I hope they're not too narrow and yes, and frightening, let's say. And this is the situation now. So it's pretty generous. You can see the shift also, this cultural building, our building here, and this rather large open space that we kept, let's say, from the material point of view, basically as it was. So it's asphalt. It has a very industrial character. We didn't want to change that. We only gave the tree a bigger foot in order to keep it happy. These were basically my main points. I would like to close with a painting, with two paintings actually, two frescoes that Ambrogio Lorenzetti painted between 1337 and 1340 in the Palazzo Pubblico of Siena. They are called Il buon e il cattivo governo, so the good and bad government, and they show Lorenzetti was commissioned by the government, by the at that time government of Siena, to do these paintings, of course, to show how good they were. I mean, how good the government were. And so Lorenzetti paints this. You can see this is not a good guy. In fact, he's a tyrant, and he's around him are all possible vices that you can imagine. And he shows Lorenzetti. Justice is here imprisoned, but he shows at the side of it, at the side of this bad governor, what happens to the city. And if you look closely, I hope you will have a good screen. If you look closely, you can see the city is in ruins. It's very damaged. It has big holes here, and on the streets, very bad things happen. This gentleman is killed. Here, somebody is robbed. So that's what happens with the bad government. What happens to the city? This is the result of the good government. I don't show you the good government. Of course, the good government is a very handsome man with a beard, and like a important king. But please look at what is happening on in and with the city. Girls are dancing on the street. Everybody's moving freely and without any risk along the street and in the squares. People are at work here. A teacher is teaching, not on Zoom, but in reality to his students here. So everything is very, very nice. And the city itself, the city is in very good shape, apparently. All houses are kept very, very well. And more than that, there are workers here that continue to build the city to make it even more modern, nicer, and more attractive. The city, of course, is Siena. If you haven't recognized it, you can look here. That's the dome of Siena, and these bifers here. These were the windows that had to be built on Piazza del Campo as an ornament to the piazza. So we are in Piazza del Campo and we look at the city. It's interesting, I think, that the city is, of course, it is Siena as it was at the time, idealized. But what Lorenzetti shows here is that the work on the city is a work on society. So, what happens with the people and what happens with the houses is very similar. And here, I think, even if these paintings are over 8 centuries ago, is something that we can, as architects and as urban designers, still learn. Again, the work on the city is a work on society. Cities, I believe, arise where and only where public interests are valued over private ones. The city is a built community. To build a good, robust, durable community, we need, I think, to use in responsible and creative ways the accumulated knowledge of the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vittorio. Would you like to stop? Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, So thank you for your thoughts and sharing them. Really fascinating to see your work as a historian, all those wonderful catalogs, but also the work you've done in documentation and trying to build this knowledge, so to speak, and codify it ways that you can really apply it and share it more broadly. I also just love the way you've sort of framed the work on the city is a work on society. And, there are 2 or 3 questions I'd like to ask before we go to the audience. And I urge the audience to please post your questions in the Q&A. But, the first one that I want to kind of start with, and I'll follow up with a couple others, is, this notion of simultaneity in the making of cities. I mean, today, because of the conversations about climate change, I mean, all the realities and the effects that we have to grapple with in cities, time has become something that we have to imagine. It's really interesting, the cities that you showed us, especially in the studies. I mean, I think what marks them all is, in some ways, the slowness of time, the extended time, the course corrections, the additions, the incrementality, of course, a shared language and value around architecture, which keeps a sense of consistency. But time is really not a quality, but it's a narrative of sorts, which in an extended time allows those cultures to develop a chemistry, people, where shared values also evolve. Today, in many parts of the world, this sort of simultaneity of building big chunks of the city, I mean, look what's happening in China and India, of course, needs completely different responses. And in your work, you've showed some of that, which I'd like to come later, because there's even architecture gets implicated in an interesting way. But what are your reflections about what we learn from cities, and then how we can learn about the notion of time in landscape architecture, the culture? I mean, in that culture, the time is always embedded in every imagination, just because the way plants grow, the way nature evolves. In cities, we maybe haven't yet found the right way to grapple with this question, which I call, the narrative, not a quality, but narrative, really.
Difficult question. Thank you, Rahul, for it. I would say, let's say, in my view, there are somehow two ways to look at time. One is a very simple one, and that is the fact that every urban intervention, more than architecture, it's true probably also for architecture, for a certain architect, but every urban intervention, if it's not too bad, gets better aging. So, I mean, you know it very well. When the Novartis campus was finished, immediately after it was finished, it really looked like an architectural model in scale 1:1, because it was done so quickly and it was so new and it had no patina. I have to say now that the white stone of the street is not so wide anymore, and that there are some things and the buildings show a sign of life. The trees have grown, of course. That's also quite important. I think it's, if I may say so, in modesty, I'm not saying it's good. In any case, it's better than it was. So the rest is not for me to judge. This is one point. But the other point, or the other way to look at it, is, I think, much more serious and much more important. If you think about it, all the case studies, examples that I've shown in this daring genealogy that I tried to construct of the single squares, all the squares were pretty expensive, strong, and even rough interventions in the city. I mean, Vigevano, for instance, Ludovico Sforza was not a tender and sensible or sensitive man. He just, pushed it through and destroyed a lot of houses. And still, it somehow it has become, even if it's a rather rude intervention, it is embedded in the city. It is a layer of the city. It is a, let's say, part of the story that the city tells you if you want to read it, which is something that I would like to, convey to at least to my students and also to my friends. But what we have now is a tendency, at least from what I see, what kind of commissions we get or what kind of competitions we are invited to. The tendency is we start anew. Now we tear everything down because it has no value, and we start anew. And aside now of ecological preoccupations, which we cannot put aside, incidentally, but even if we could put them aside, it is a big loss because the cities tend to erase their own history. And I think one of the big qualities, even of cities that are not particularly beautiful, like Milan, for instance, is that it has all these layers and that you can read it in depth, and that gives you, even if you don't understand every single episode that the city wants to tell you, you feel an intensity and tie with life that no wonderful architect's project can produce.
Thank you, Vittorio. There's some very interesting questions that have come into the question and answers, but I want to ask you one more question, which I think might set the ground for some of the other questions. And this idea of, you said separating architecture and urban space, and I mean, I think a lot of your work is trying to bring them together, trying to create an armature within which architecture can also sit. Architecture in the recent past has had this impulse to be quite autonomous, right? And I think this has been part of your mission to kind of restrain the complete autonomy of architecture, especially when it has and bears the responsibility to also make urban space. Because architecture in the last decades has become a movable feast. It doesn't grow out necessarily of the values of the place, but it can, music can be a movable feast, but for architecture to be a movable feast is highly problematic. And I think what's sort of interesting is this tension, because I think, the projects you did in Zurich, for example, you did the architecture too, correct? In some of these projects, and set up the urban armature also. Am I right in saying that?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And so therefore the architecture there is incredibly well mannered. It speaks to the urban space and its formation. I know on the Novartis campus, which is also another kind of beauty that emerges from it, is the tension, because you had to get 20 people to be well mannered to make it successful, so that the buildings could talk to the urban space. And so I just sort of wanted you to reflect about this sort of this tension, in a sense, of the impulse of architecture to be autonomous. In fact, it's become inherent with that culture, but your role, in a way, in a mission to try to make a room where people are civil to each other.
Yes, I simply think that no city can be made by as a kind of addition of individuals. If these individuals don't talk to each other, and if they don't accept a number of rules, it will never be a city. It will be, yes, like the Novartis campus, where you have, thank God, at least I could control the public spaces. So at least the streets are all paved the same way, the sidewalks. Everybody was laughing at me because we were drawing the sidewalks in scale 1 to 10. But the sidewalks keep the whole thing somehow still together, because otherwise it would just be an architectural exhibition. And, between an architectural exhibition and the city, there is a big difference.
Yes, no, absolutely. And, your idea of public interest over private ones, we'll come back to it if some questions don't address that issue, because, I mean, there really is a difference between America and Europe in that sense, where when private interests are privileged, then the tension becomes of another kind, which means the role of the urban designer becomes more complicated in some ways. But I think that might come up in the question. So let me jump to the question. I'm going to start with George Baird. George, Baird asks you, Vittorio's historical examples were all in city centers. His actual projects were all outside the city centers. Also, none of his historic examples included trees, and all of his contemporary projects did. Can I ask him to comment on the implications of these two important differences?
Very good question. I think it has, well, let's say the point of view of saying it's in the center, it's not in the center. I would argue it's just a question of occasion. I have not been asked to redesign Piazza del Duomo in Milan. No, I'm joking, because of course Piazza del Duomo needs absolutely not to be redesigned because it's there and it's quite perfect. Because I think that let's say the larger city extensions, and two of them we were lucky enough to be involved, happen at the edge of the city. But I would say we should endeavor not to make them edges of the city. You know, when Ildefonso Cerdà designed his extension of Barcelona, his main aim was to say this extension, which was very, very large, creates the same quality of life and also the same value of land everywhere in a totally homogeneous form. Of course, the value he did not succeed in obtaining, but he did succeed in obtaining a city extension as a city. And so the idea of not allowing a city to flow away in suburbia is something that I think we should strive to do. Regarding the trees, I think it's difficult today or it makes little sense today to do a square without trees. Because even in let's say more northern situations like Switzerland, the summer is very hot, and trees are an important feature. And so it's true, we tend to choose. I think there are typologies of streets and squares that do not allow for trees, but we tend to choose those with trees because we think they are more fit for the climate situation in which we are. I don't think they help much for the climate, frankly, the few trees that we plant in our squares, but they do a lot for the people.
Thank you, Vittorio. So, I mean, there's a question here. I'm not going in any order. I'll come back. I'm just trying to tie the subjects to the question of public interest over private ones. It's from Stephen Gray. And he says, most of the historic examples of squares, as well as your own more contemporary examples, the square as a primary and basic manifestation of public and shared spaces were commissioned, financed, and often created to serve an urban elite, whether aristocratic or tech class. How does one square this reality, square is now used in a different context, how does one square this reality with your closing thesis that the health of the city relates directly to the health or viability of the public sector, that is the government, which in most cases you've shared has been in service to the elite developers and the educated upper class, so therefore a contradiction?
It is a contradiction, but I was not talking so much, I mean, I was not, when I say that the city is built community, I'm not talking so much of the government, I'm talking of the inhabitants, of the residents. And how they organize themselves, that's a question, that's a big question to be answered in different political contexts.
So therefore, you're implying that then urban design sets up an imagination and armature which allows even the underrepresented to engage with the process.
Yes, I think, I think we can, what we can do is we can do two things. We can create options. We can create options for things, for good things like encounters, interaction, integration to happen. If they happen or not, that's not something that we as designers can really decide or influence. We can influence it by making it possible, and we can also influence it by making it impossible, because there are also places, there are also spaces that just do not allow, or that they discourage any interaction. And that's our responsibility. I wouldn't go beyond that. That the other responsibility is our responsibility as citizens, as citizens.
You might have partly answered the next question, but nevertheless, I'm going to read it out. It's from an anonymous attendee. It says, "Thank you, Vittorio, for your enticing presentation, which truly brings out the vibrancy and the power of public squares. This question comes from a group of young designers, young urban designers, passionate about walking and biking in the city. What advice would you offer young designers wanting to build democracy in cities in our modern world?"
You cannot build democracy. It would be nice. You can build spaces that can be easily, let's say, occupied by democracy, but democracy you cannot build. What you can do is, I think, create what I said before, these options. Now, spaces that allow and encourage people to come together, to meet even by chance, and to integrate themselves. If this happens or not, this frankly we cannot say. But on the other hand, the life of the city is so strong and so long, hopefully, if it's not destroyed or torn down by speculation or war or something else, that we should be a little bit more modest. And we do not build for the next, especially if we build a city or a part of the city, we do not build for the next 10 or 20 years. We build for the next 100 years. And we do not know what will happen in 100 years. So that's what I mean when I say we have to create this kind of options, and to create this kind of options, again, I think that looking at historical example can be very useful, because those examples show also, let's say, the resilience, I would say, the architectural and spatial resilience of at least some of those spaces. If you look at the history, basically of all these squares that I've shown, they have done all kinds of things. No, they have taken up all kinds of functions, from merely representative function. Take Piazza Ducale in Vigeva. No? I mean, it was really meant as the pure representation of the power of a tyrant, because Ludovico Moro was not, as I said, a nice man. But the square itself has changed its functions totally, and now it has become the real center of Vigevano. So it's not anymore the fortress, but it's the piazza, and it's really the place where the people from Vigevano, thank God it's not so touristically discovered, but people from Vigevano meet and sit in a cafe and see each other. It's the living room of the Vigevano is very small. It's the living room of this small city.
Thank you, Vittorio. Vittorio, there are a number of questions which want to grapple with the contemporary, of course, the pandemic, COVID, and I'll come to that cluster of questions. But there's one that actually was the first question put up, which I want to go back to so we don't miss it. It just takes the discussions just for a few minutes in another direction. And it is from Sotirios. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. And the question is, Buonasera. Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to say that there is so much recognizable in your analysis and work, the influence of the Italian masters, such as Giorgio Grassi. Are there any buildings of Grassi that marked your career as an architect? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't understand acoustically the last part. Are there any building of Grassi?
That marked your career as an architect. That influenced you as an architect.
Buonasera, thank you. Yes, definitely. I mean, Giorgio Grassi has influenced me, I would say less with his buildings than with his, let's say, his personality and teaching.
Okay, so let me take, I think there are two questions which, this is from Ogden Ross. How does a pandemic affect the response of the city to proximity? The early COVID attacks on Italian cities was particularly severe. Thereby, social distancing must take into account the reciprocal need for social closeness. Edward T. Hall's seminal work, The Hidden Dimension, comes to mind, and Vitruvius ultimately determines the proportions of space. Do you utilize a proportional idea or system in your designs? And there's one that sort of, I think, takes it to a larger scale, which I'm just going to read also, which is Sharon says, in an age of decreased physical interaction, the wake of COVID-19 and the remote working, what will the public spaces of cities look like in the future?
These are many questions in one. No, maybe let's start with the pandemic. Frankly, you know, I hope, as we all hope, that this will go away. Probably it will not go away, but it will be controlled somehow. And as happy as I am that I can be on campus and see my students in their faces, as happy I will be being on public squares and seeing my compatriots and citizens in the spaces. Not to answer the question directly, I don't think that COVID will. I think that it will change. It has changed, and it will still change our life. But I very much hope, and I believe actually also, that it will not take away the pleasure of meeting, especially, you know, in an open space, which is, I will not say secure, but it's a rather small risk. As far as we know, the pandemic that struck northern Italy did not happen because the Italians like to be in bars outside and drink coffee, but it happened in the houses, in the apartments, in the institutions, in the closed space.
Thank you, Vittorio. And then there are two questions which, at least in my mind, seem to be related, but I'm sorry to load so much on you. One is from Sudik Shea, which is, this might be an idealistic situation, but not an impossible one. What could be done as the most basic step to try to make US neighborhoods and communities more interactive today in order to make them vibrant in the coming years? And there's a second question, which is from Roberto, which says, hello, thank you, Vittorio, for a presentation. What Vittorio defines as a city are instead confined moments. How does the concept of the square as an enclosed, often symmetrical space can adapt to the complex morphologies of the contemporary metropolis?
Help me with the first question. I just
is that, you know, what might be the ways that one could use your ideas and observations for US neighborhoods and communities?
Yes, sorry. Yes.
And so therefore the contemporary and the US, I'm conflating them as one kind of.
Yes. No, I think that's fairly, in my view, it's fairly simple as an answer. It's very difficult to do by densification. If you don't have, I mean, the cities that I've shown and the squares that are, you know, full of life and so on, they can exist only if around them there is enough density, meaning enough people, to really use these squares. If this is not the case, then it will not work. And so, you know, it's easily said densification in an American suburb or also in a European suburb. But that's exactly what we tried to do with the Richti. And it was pretty interesting in this case, in the case of the Richti, that the people living in the small houses that I showed you, so living in this very low density, they agreed on, because in Switzerland, everything must be voted. So it's a total democracy, and they had to vote in favor or against. The people living there had to vote in favor or against the project. And they voted in favor because they understood that this would give a little bit more, you know, vibrance and bring a little bit more life in this otherwise rather sleepy neighborhood. Regarding the shapes, you know, I just don't believe that shapes and political or social systems are linked in a way that cannot be modified. So I think that in a clear geometrical situation, you can move as freely and as openly as in an irregular shape. I would not consider, let's say, the relation between a social system and a spatial system as immutable as you seem to imply.
Thanks, Vittorio. You know, I'm going to just pose one more question because we're out of time. And there are about 4 or 5 other questions, but in my understanding, I think in your various responses, you've answered them. So I'm sorry to the ones that I haven't got to, because I do believe they were answered. But there's one question which I'd just like to put to you, contemporary concerns. It's from Diane Wildsmith, which says, in reference to new green cities or smart cities, do you believe it's possible to identify contemporary types which will give a social and economic focus to new urban plazas?
Yes, I think so. I think so. We have to look for them. It's also it's a little a matter of what one understands under green city. I don't think that a city can be a forest, because we need houses and we need shelter and we need, in some ways, you know, the cities have been made to protect ourselves from nature, and we will never really overcome a certain degree of dichotomy and conflict between the city and nature. But I think we can, first of all, make our cities compact so that the landscape is spared, is left alone. And we can mitigate this conflict with appropriate green spaces.
Thank you, Vittorio. All good things must come to an end. So with that, I want to thank you. But I also want to take this opportunity to say, for those of you who are at the GSD, the students, and maybe in proximity in Boston, on Friday from 5 to 6, with Dean Whiting, Vittorio is going to be in a conversation. And it'll be an extension of this conversation about his lecture. We're going to meet in the front porch of the GSD. So it'll be sort of in a semi-open space, of course, wearing masks and socially distanced. But it'll be an opportunity for us to also interact with you in person. So please, whoever is interested, do come for that. It'll be an extension of this discussion on the lecture, but Vittorio could also share with us, and I hope he will, the kinds of questions he's exploring in the option studio he's doing at the GSD, because I think that set of questions that came up at the end, which had to do with contemporary interpretations, whether they're in America, the contemporary city, is really the center of the explorations that Vittorio is doing at the GSD this semester with the students. So this is an extension of an invitation to join us in on the front porch of Gund Hall on Friday between 5 and 6. And with that, Vittorio, thank you once again. It's a pleasure to have you at the GSD. We continue these conversations in the next few months. So thanks again for sharing your insights and your observations and your work. Thank you. And thank you all for attending and being part of this conversation.
Thank you very much also on my part.
Thanks.
Bye, Rahul. And
Bye.
Thanks to everybody. I wish I could see you all on a public space.